So, welcome to the Light Conversations, and I am so delighted today to be joined by the one, the only Jill Purce. It's wonderful to connect with you through the powers of technology. How are you today, and where in the world are you at the moment?
I'm in London and I'm isolating with Rupert, just the two of us in the house. Both my boys are isolating somewhere else. And Merlin's book's just come out, Entangled Life, so that's all very exciting. But he's up in Nottinghamshire and his partner's just joined him. And Cosmo's in a cottage in the Dorset Woods making music with birdsong, endangered birds. And Rupert is working away, I'm working away, and it's completely blissful. I have to say, we're going for long walks on Hampstead Heath. I'm experimenting with and having such fun with cooking and relaxing and not being in a hurry. And I've started experimenting with family constellations online and teaching online, and that's interesting also.
Yeah, it must be because
Yeah.
having done Family Constellations and the Healing Voice, all of your workshops in person, it was a very powerful, profound experience. So, taking it into the digital realm, is it possible to create that sort of intimacy online?
It's well, I that's what I was wondering. I mean, my work is about social intimacy, so it's the exact reverse. And of course, singing is difficult as well because you're projecting, your air and so forth. So and it's so much about community, physical community. So that was my big question, is it possible? And then I had people who had enrolled on my week intensive, my residential, and who'd postponed. And so I gave 3 Zoom teachings for them, and they loved it. It went really, really well. And they all felt that we were all together in the oneness, which was very interesting. And then yesterday I experimented with a kind of, I worked out a way of doing family constellations online, and that was extraordinary. It worked really, really well. I mean, it's a little more tiring and it takes longer, and there's no doubt that you miss the physical contact, the humanness of the presence. But I think I can figure out a way of making it work.
Well, it sounds like you've done that, and kudos to you for just adapting with the times. Maybe can we go into a bit what is family constellation work for those who don't know what that is?
Sure. Well, family constellation work works with the assumption that we're part of a family and ancestral field, which has a particular quality and is very particular to us. And if there's any kind of separation or trauma or for example, early deaths or suicides or murders or emigrations or abortions or addictions or um, giving children up for adoption, death in battle, death in childbirth, um, uh, uh, accidents, mental illness, and anything of this kind, going back generations, there's a kind of interruption in the ongoing life of the people involved, causing a trauma which has a pattern of stability. It has a stability in the field, and it goes down through the generations, and seems to um, claim people in every generation to in some way resonate with or follow in the same pattern, that the original person, that this happened to the original person. And so people find themselves doing the same thing over the generations. And this work is really quite extraordinary. It's about remembering that which has been forgotten. It's about bringing back the dismembered parts, bringing back, acknowledging that which has been forgotten, and honoring those who've been exiled and excluded. So sometimes if somebody has done something dodgy, somebody's been an abuser in the family or done something, or some unfairness, for example, there's a lot of problems through inheritance, and if things are dodgy dealers and all these kinds of things, if there's somebody considered to be a kind of inappropriate member of the family, the tendency is to exile them and to push them away. And but then you punish yourself because you feel guilty. And so it's much more powerful if you honor that person, if you see them, if you bring them back so that they take their rightful place within the field of the family and of the ancestors, and then they can look kindly on the living and order is restored within the family, and this has an extraordinarily powerfully healing effect on everybody. And so people can do this work, and it affects all members of the family because we're part of a field. And so, you know, everybody's connected through time. It's about working in the present to transform the past and transform the future. And the effect is utterly astonishing. And what's so interesting now is that finally something which Darwin clearly believed in, and many before him and since, was the inheritance of acquired characters or characteristics, which is now become known as epigenetics. And so what this is showing is that whether, for example, any kind of racial traumas like the Holocaust or the famine in Holland after the war, or in Finland when people had to emigrate to Sweden, so many generations later, there's mental illness, there's chemical changes, there's these things go on through the generations. And this is now the hot subject in the physical sciences, in the life sciences, and it's, you know, in worms and there's the most interesting example actually is the inheritance of fear in mice. So this is about 5 years ago in Atlanta. Mice were subjected to electric shocks while smelling a particular innocent smell, acetophenone, totally, pleasant smell like almonds, flowers, or something. And then these mice were bred in vitro. And they found that the children mice and the grandchildren mice who'd never met their parents were completely terrified of the smell. So there's been work going on where something like 15 generations have been found to continue these patterns. You know, something that is so clear in this work is now delightfully being corroborated by science.
That's really
I so often behind.
I imagine there will be a heavy load of work for you after this lockdown period, with all these families being contained in their homes for extended periods. I mean, the effect that that's going to have on all of us, we don't know yet, and we
don't know, especially with children who are being brought up in this situation, not understanding why they can't play with other children, why they can't be with other children, or I mean, this is baffling for children. And so it's exactly the opposite. You know, we're thrust apart, we're separated, and this work is about bringing together the separated bits into a whole, inducting order into the system. So I think you're right. I think there's going to be a lot of healing work needed when this is calmed down.
Are there any steps you could suggest that families can take at this time to avoid heavy healing work in the future, or do you think we just have to ride this out and go with the flow?
I think we have to ride it out. You know, none of us know the implications really and the ramifications. I mean, they're so huge in every possible aspect of our lives, both societally, culturally, financially. You know, we really have no idea. I mean, the only hopeful thing is that in the past, when there have been these kind of situations, you know, in the plague and so on, that some of the most powerful innovations have come about in these periods. So I mean, it was so clear that we were headed for disaster one way or another. It wasn't clear which way it was going to go, because it could have gone in any direction. You know, every which way we looked, we were headed over a cliff, really, with climate change, and it could have gone anyway. And so it went this way, and it was so clear that everything has to change. And I mean, nothing, you know, the obvious thing is there are no airplanes in the sky. And I was walking on the heath the other day. I was taking a photograph of Rupert. The sun was coming out through the trees, and it was a very glorious moment. And I was in the path, and somebody came up to me. They were waiting for me. And I said, "Oh, I won't be a moment." And they said, it was a family with a dog. "We're not in a hurry," they said. and it's just so glorious that you know, we're not in a hurry. And when have we not been in a hurry?
It's true. So we're all being given the gift of slowing down.
Yes, it's so there are very profound gifts in this, I think. I mean, there's no question that people are suffering desperately, and if people live in a tiny place with no outside space and you know, can't get food and are ill. I mean, there's no question that people are suffering very differentially. I mean, you know, some people are finding it very blissful, and some people obviously are finding it very, very difficult indeed. And people with children are having a hard time, you know, both trying to educate them and trying to explain to them what's happening. So it really, and they're bored, of course. They're bored out of their minds, some of them, if they're really little.
We are all parents being called upon to be like incredible entertainers as well as teachers suddenly. No pressure.
Well, you should know this.
Um, thank you for giving a bit of insight into the ancestral healing work. I'd love to know, because the other workshop I did with you was the healing voice, and actually we discussed how it was really quite important and effective to do the ancestral healing work before going into the healing voice. Can you explain a bit why or how they complement and support each other? These are quite different works.
Well, the way I do the family constellations is completely unique to myself, because many of the people who do family constellations were influenced by or taught by somebody who was taught by Bert Hellinger. And he was a German therapist who died last year, and who I knew very well because he used my husband Rupert Sheldrake's theory to explain the family field. And so we used to see him very regularly, and I worked with him. But I started this work long, long before he became well known. And quite independently, I was teaching in Munich, and somebody said, you know, asked me if I knew of his work, because it was not known outside of Germany at that time in the early 80s. And so I developed my own way of doing this quite independently, because I was working with doing generalized ceremonies for the ancestors. I found that if we go back through our ancestors, honoring them, it changes everything for everybody. And because I started my work many, many years ago working with sound, because I found that working with our reclaiming our voices was something that was extraordinarily important, because all spiritual paths, the core of them is really about how to be present. And so the voice is the key to that, and I'll come back to that. And so I started working with the voice. So when I started doing family constellations, I had developed a way of doing it where the work is enveloped or enveloped really by sound. We work with the voice between each person, and use the voice in very amazing ways. But the work with the sound is really key, because as I said, the most important thing in any spiritual tradition is how to be present. And normally we are every impulse, everything that alerts us to the or attracts our attention, we process it in relation to what happened before, and on the basis of what we haven't done in the past, we have the obligations through these regrets, obligations to do them in the future. So we're thrust into a kind of timeline separate from ourselves, and separate from the present. So everything that happens to us separates us and puts us in this timeline which has no reality. The past and the future don't exist. And yet we spend all our time in them, because time has a past and a future. And the thing about sound is that it brings you into the present, because you can only chant in the present. You can think about other things, but if you, while you're chanting, you're listening to yourself chanting, you're creating a circuit of attention. So that means that if you're listening to the sound that you're making while you're making it, and you're making it continuously, it means you're continuously in the present. And this is absolutely key. And then another aspect of sacred chant, which everybody knows about, is mantra, which has a kind of Oriental origin, although there are Christian mantras, there are Sufi mantras, there are mantras in every tradition. But mantra is very interesting because it's a use of language, so it lulls us into this notion of the discursivity of language, beginning, middle, and end, going into the future, like a kind of dance movement, like Western music. And but so it uses words, but the words have no, it may have many words, but it doesn't make a sentence. And we may know what the words mean, but usually they're in some kind of an archaic language. So we're not burdened with the meaning continuously. And these words are repeated, and so it's like it corrals the mind. It doesn't let the mind go linguistically, discursively from here to there, like these Western dance movements, because it's constantly repeating. It's like a circular corralling motion, spiraling around us, bringing back to the central axis of ourselves continually. Mantra is a very powerful way of not letting the mind run away with itself into some projection of what we would like to happen to keep us living, because as living beings we want to stay alive, so all our agendas and strategies are about how we remain living. And so our mind is so busily working with what possible ghastlinesses might actually happen, and what we might have to strategize in order to overcome the implications of these things that happen to us. And so, but if we are corralled by this repetitive sound, which we think is language and is familiar, then it's not possible to lurch on into these desperate states of trying to remain living.
Yeah, I love that. So basically, the voice and sound are a really powerful key to presence and becoming present in the moment. But through a workshop with you, we didn't just do mantra and chanting. There were some really interesting vocal techniques that I learned with you that were radical. Like, I had never encountered them before. Things such as overtone chanting and other ways of using the voice to create a sort of sonic field. Can we talk a bit about that?
Sure. Well, overtone chanting is really interesting. One of the things that happened in the 17th century in Western music was the ubiquitousness of keyboard instruments. Everybody started having keyboard instruments, and then there was this horrible thing called the tuning problem, because traditionally when you tune instruments, you go from one note to the note 5 notes above. It's called a fifth, unsurprisingly. Mm-hmm. And then you go from that note to its fifth, and then its fifth, and its fifth, and this is called in music the cycle of fifths. Well, what happens when you should reach the octave above where you start? You don't. You overlap it by a quarter of a semitone, known as the Pythagorean comma. And this overlap just puts the spanner in the works of all traditional tuning systems. So with the onset of these instruments, these keyboard instruments, piano, for example, eventually, a whole new tuning system had to happen, because when you played in one part of the piano, it was in tune, and when you played in another part, or the keyboard, it was horrible. It was really out of tune. And so people wrestled with this, polymaths, musicians, creators of instruments, mathematicians, everybody was wrestling with this problem in the 17th century. And then finally, what was accepted after many, many attempts were made was what's called the tempered scale. So what the tempered scale means is that this quarter of a semitone is is put back into the octave. It's sort of rammed back inside, meaning that all the intervals which normally would be in tune aren't anymore, because some are bigger than they should be and some are smaller than they should be. So they're all kind of out of tune. So and this was adopted. Bach was really the first person to adopt something similar. So all music before Bach, all music since Bach has been out of tune, which means that we couldn't possibly have had this glorious tradition in the Western music art tradition after Bach without this. I call it a Faustian bargain. We'll make all our music out of tune and look what we can do with it. And so the idea was that nobody would notice, and most people don't notice because the intervals are quite small. So when I started work with the voice, because I realized that we'd lost our voice, that we weren't using our voices, we weren't joining choirs because we had to have an audition and sing in tune and read music. And when I started, not anymore, of course, with community choirs, but then you had to. So when I started, I wanted to find something really fundamental, some way of reclaiming our voices. So for people who sang, for example, musicians, non-musicians, people who were told to stand in the back and mouth it, the whole gamut of musical abilities. I wanted to do something which none of them knew how to do, but also which meant that we could really be in tune, which means sound. To be sound means to be in tune. So to be sound in mind and body, and to really resonate and induct order into the system. So this was not possible with Western music because of the problem I just described. So the way that I started to work was I learned very much from the tradition of um, music from Central Asia, so from Tibet, from Mongolia and Tuva, for example, where you chant on a single note. That's all you do. You chant on a single note, but you change the shape of the resonant cavities so that you change the resonance. Resonance means to resound. So you contain the sound long enough, you resound so that it resounds. But then by changing the cavities, you can amplify these inner sounds, which are called overtones, harmonics, or partials, so that they are louder than the note you're actually chanting. And the intervals between these can only be in tune. So when we do this together, you hear a drone, and I'll maybe do it for you in a moment. You hear a drone, and then you hear the high flute-like sounds floating above the fundamental note. And it really sounds like the music of the spheres. It's very, very magical because the sounds are very pure. They're totally in tune, and they're bell-like because they have no harmonics. And so this is completely fundamental to the nature of sound making. And so I use this to understand the whole nature of sound, the nature of the voice, and the sort of fundaments of meditative use of the voice, or meditation altogether. While really inducting order into the physical body, as well as the mental and the emotional and the spiritual body. So maybe I don't know how it's going to sound, but I'll try.
Oh my gosh, amazing. I mean, I love, you are such an expert when you speak. To me, the sound is like a portal to another dimension when we were doing this all together. And so, yes, please, if you could share a bit of your technique, that would be amazing.
Okay, I'll try. So I'm going to make a single note.
Awesome. That's magical. Magical. And you've recorded 2 albums which have sort of elements of this overtone chanting. Is that correct?
Yes, I have overtone chanting meditations, which is particularly overtone chanting, and then the healing voice, which is a kind of half-hour lecture about the whole sort of things that I'm talking about, and then chanting and group chanting. Yes, I have these on CD and even cassettes. Actually, people are asking for cassettes again. There's a craze for cassettes amongst the young
Yes, I think I actually
musicians.
bought a cassette from you. I just bought Madonna's new album on cassette, and then you had some cassettes. I was like, I'll get that too. Could we hop back a tiny bit to the time you spent creating music with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, because that is so iconic and so important in terms of musical history. What kind of sounds were you developing and creating together then?
Well, I was working with him in between 71 and 74 in Germany, in Kürten, where he lived. And that was, I mean, in 1968, he'd written a piece called Stimmung for 6 singers, doing a very simple form of vocal harmonics. And he was really the first to bring the harmonics into the Western world from Central Asia. I mean, he didn't get it exactly from Central Asia. I mean, he got it just from working with he created electronic music by using sine waves. So he built music up from the separate aspects of sound itself, and then put them all together, all the different parameters of sound, the harmonics, the dynamics, the melody, you know, all possible parameters of sound. He built up from pure sine waves. And so harmonics is just one of the parameters of sound that he worked with and developed in this piece called Stimmung with 6 singers. And so the first thing that when I went to live and work with him that happened was we went on a tour with Stimmung. This was in 71, all around North America, well, East Coast North America, Canada, and America, and the United States. And so I got this very sort of deep induction into that. And then we created a piece together called Alphabet for Liège, which was a piece which was commissioned by the city of Liège to happen in a half-built television studio. And so I was very interested in the effect of sound on matter, and how, in fact, this is one of the things that started me on sound, is that, you know, if you take chaotic forms, liquids of different viscosities and powders, and you subject them to different vibrations, different pitches, what you can see before you is the induction of form of different kinds, of the patterns on the backs of animals and shells and you know, zebras and so forth. And you see sound creating literally before your eyes. So I was very interested in the creativity of sound. And so the piece that we worked on together was to show 13 different installations, all of which happened in these different connected rooms, which are half-built studios, so that there were windows between all the rooms, showing the different effects of sound on matter. So one was, the one I was working on was doing mantra onto bread. We were baking bread, and I was chanting into it, and the audience were testing the unchanted on and the chanted on bits of bread to see if they could tell the difference. And then there was dissolving sound with sound, making love with sound. There was somebody working with fish. There was somebody working with breaking glass with sound. So Hugh Davis had these huge sheets of glass, and he had a siren, which is an instrument for changing the pitch by turning a knob. So he bolted on these huge bits of glass. They had a hole in the middle, and he bolted them on, and he poured water on the top, and then he turned up and down this siren, and everybody was sort of gathered round this sort of enormous shaking piece of glass. And then he'd find the harmonics of the glass, and then the pattern would get extremely sort of rhythmic, and this beautiful pattern of the water on the glass. And then finally, you know, he would do what he called worrying it, which would go very slightly above and below the actual pitch of the glass. And then, you know, he's saying, and then the glass would break. So it was a wonderful example of because a sound creates form, and the sound of the form itself is that which dissolves the form it creates. And so this was a wonderful example of dissolving or destroying the form of a thing through the sound of its own sound. And so anyway, that was just one of the installations. So there were many different installations in this piece.
Oh my goodness, it sounds like a really incredibly creative, experimental time, and at the same time, very timeless. That what you just described would be, I can see that in the Tate Modern now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So is there anything in particular that you're looking forward to when we get out of this period of lockdown, and when we start to engage socially again?
Well, it would be nice to do physical, you know, obviously to meet people again, and to do physical workshops. I mean, at the moment, Rupert and I are walking, you know, on the heath every day, which is wonderful. I'm doing lots of exercises, lots of cooking, things which I didn't always have time for in the past, and this is quite wonderful. I mean, I have to say I'm really enjoying that. And because I work a lot anyway, except for, you know, traveling in the summer and traveling and teaching, I quite often, you know, don't see other people than my family anyway. But I'm longing to see my family again, and my children, my boys, and who are all doing very exciting things at the moment. And yes, I really longing to be able to do workshops again, physical workshops, not just working online. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit for a moment about what the boys are doing? Because they both have
Sure.
exciting things going on now. I actually saw, I have painting on the wall in my bedroom by an artist called Colin Elder, and I saw that he did the artwork for the cover of Merlin's book.
Oh, really?
Yes. I was like, that's so cool. Or he did some illustrations, some artwork. There's
Okay.
a
Well,
drawing he did of funguses growing
yes, yes,
around the book.
yes.
Yes, and so the title of that book is
Entangled Life, how fungi creates our world, changes our minds, and shapes our futures. So this came out yesterday, or the day before yesterday, the 12th of May in the United States and Canada. It was going to come out last week in the UK, but because of the crisis, the warehouses, they thought the warehouses were closed, and Amazon was prioritizing food and so forth. So they postponed it until September in the UK. But it came out it's had the most extraordinary reviews. I have to say, I've read it twice. It's quite brilliant. It changes your perspective. It's the world from the sort of view of a fungal world, which is everywhere, and we don't realize it, and we just have no idea. We just think of mushrooms. We don't think of just in what way it's sort of inside us and around us in every way. And so it changes our perspective completely. And also it's very, very funny. I mean, and it's beautifully written. I mean, I'm completely astonished how every
Merlin
sentence,
the fungi.
I know, every sentence is so elegantly expressed. You know, I found myself stopping and just underlining it and gasping, because I just loved the way he expressed everything. It's so unexpected and eccentric and so beautiful. And also it's very, very funny. You know, I'm just astonished. So that's Merlin anyway. So that's very exciting. And he's doing a lot of things online, a lot of interviews. He did a very, very interesting interview a couple of days ago with Science and Non-Duality, which is on YouTube, and I highly recommend people looking at that. And then also an interview with Robert McFarlane, which is and it's worth going on his website, merlinsheldrake.com, and seeing all the things people have said about the book, and get the book. And Cosmo Sheldrake, who's my younger son, who's a musician, he's living in the country in the middle of a forest at the moment. So he was going to be doing the music for Cirque du Soleil in Berlin in October, but that's been cancelled, obviously. So he's particularly concerned with endangered species. So he's been recording bird songs of all kinds and making extraordinary music using bird songs. So he captures music, records different natural sounds, and then transforms them into utterly beautiful music. And his album, The Much Much How and I, came out I think a year or two ago. I'm not sure, lost track now, which is wonderful. So he's just making wonderful music in the woods.
We love that album. We listen to it a lot at home. It's great. And Cosmo is fantastic. He's one of the greatest singer-songwriters out there at the moment. And I was delighted to get to meet him when I was working with you as well. I think I bought every bit of paraphernalia he had available, from vinyls to tea towels, and was giving them out as gifts. And Rupert,
children. I mean, I know you have young children, but children love his music.
oh my gosh! And also the music videos. My daughter loves the fish, the
Yes.
illustrated, these beautiful hand painted fish floating around in the Come Along video. Really cool. And Rupert also has quite a presence online at the moment, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah, so Rupert Sheldrake, my husband, he's doing a lot of work at the moment, a lot of experimental work, and he's always been interested in epigenetics, and he's revisiting his work on epigenetics now. I mean, he was working on it before it was called that, and so he's going to be writing on that. The inheritance of acquired characters that I was talking about earlier. So he's busying away. We're all working away, doing our thing.
So do you actually, moving forward into the future, do you enjoy this combination of the healing voice and the ancestral work? Do they inform and nurture each other, or are they completely separate? Thank
They absolutely not separate at all. No, they're very related. I mean, they're particularly related because of the way I use the voice in both of them. So, but they're both completely essential ways of transformation. You know, of healing. Um, I mean, in a way, they're two different ways of working. But I mean, most people like you do both kinds with me. And I also do these very extended ceremonies, these mandala ceremonies. You have yet to do that, which take a week. And the mandala is this extraordinary diagram. It comes from the rotation around the stupa, which happened, the Buddha was very late. The figure of the Buddha, as we know it, is a very late figure and came when the Buddhists met the Greeks in Afghanistan. But before that, people rotated around an axis, around a stupa, as a kind of circumambulation. And that really is what the mandala is. It's a kind of flat. It's like a plan of the stupa, and so it's a rotary diagram, and it embodies the constituents of consciousness, as well as the afflictive emotions, as well as the times of day, the times of year, and how we can transform our afflictive emotions into their corresponding wisdoms. It's a very sort of deeply packed diagram of consciousness. And so what I did is I developed a way of doing it with people, so that we, the people, become the mandala, and we go through ourselves over a period of a week, chanting continuously and working with a particular practice, because the mandala is also a palace for a deity, and a deity is an aspect of the development of consciousness. When you identify with this deity, you take on that particular enlightened state. That's the point of it. And so I work with these different forms of the mandala. I do two a year. Of course, they've had to stop too. But this is a very interesting example of extended ceremony, which hasn't happened. I don't think it's ever happened in the West, and maybe in Japan it happened until relatively recently. But this idea of a repeated practice every half hour, and then the whole mandala turns, and it's very extraordinary. So that's another aspect of my work, which I long to get back to.
Oh, that sounds really, really beautiful, and something I look forward to looking into more myself. So, as we come towards the end of our wonderful chat today, is there anything else that you'd like to share or you'd like people to know about you or the work you do?
Well, I mean, I think just get in touch, as I'm just about to start, doing this, experimenting with Zoom teachings, which is a new thing, and doing constellations, family constellations online. So, look at my website. As soon as I start doing them, I will announce it, and then people can join. So it's an experiment for all of us, and one that we have to do.
Thank you so much, Jill, for making the time to speak with me today about all your expertise. It's always very inspiring to hear what you have to say and learn from you. Constantly learning from you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Giada.